The year was 1944, and over the oil-rich plains of Romania, the air itself seemed to tremble with the coming storm. The Allies had identified the refineries at Ploiesti as a critical target, a sprawling complex that fueled the entire Axis war effort. Without that oil, the tanks, trucks, and planes of the German army would be stranded. Destroying it meant striking directly at the heart of Hitler's war machine. As dawn broke, the calm sky over the fields filled with the distant rumble of engines. Hundreds of American B-17 Flying Fortresses and B-24 Liberators pushed eastward, each carrying tons of bombs destined for the refineries below. The massive bombers gleamed silver in the sunlight, their wings slicing through clouds like blades. Around them flew tight formations of P-51 Mustangs, their agile shapes guarding the heavier aircraft from enemy interceptors. The Allied plan was simple: overwhelm the defenders with sheer numbers and precision. But on the ground, the Luftwaffe was ready. Sirens wailed across dusty Romanian airfields as mechanics and pilots leapt into motion. The hangars came alive with the roar of Daimler-Benz engines, the hearts of the Messerschmitt Bf-109s. Ground crews shouted over the noise as they armed the planes, and the air shimmered with heat and fume. Pilots ran to their cockpits, helmets in hand, each man knowing the odds were grim, yet unshakably determined to defend their last great source of fuel. Among them was a young man with calm gray eyes and a reputation that already bordered on myth. Erich "Booby" Hartmann. His fighter bore a small red heart just below the cockpit, a symbol his enemies would soon come to fear. He had spent years fighting on the Eastern Front, mastering every trick of aerial combat. To him, the sky was not chaos. It was a chessboard. Every maneuver, every cloud, every sunbeam was part of a larger strategy. Only he seemed to understand. As the Allied bombers approached, the German fighters roared upward in tight formation, the earth shrinking below them. The blue morning sky quickly erupted into chaos. Tracer rounds zipped past, engines screamed, and parachutes blossomed like white flowers amid the smoke. The battle over Romania had begun in earnest. From the cockpit of his Buffet 10109, Hartmann scanned the horizon. He could see the Mustangs already diving to intercept, their polished wings flashing in the light. It was a dance of life and death, fought at hundreds of kilometers per hour, where a single mistake meant oblivion. But Hartmann thrived here. His voice crackled over the radio, calm, precise, giving orders as he rolled into his first attack. What followed would become one of the most ferocious air battles of the European War. And in its heart, the red-hearted Buffet 10109 would carve its legend into the sky. As the battle over Romania raged, the sky turned into a living storm of engines, tracers, and fire. Amid the chaos, Erich Hartmann remained unnervingly calm. While many pilots relied on reflex or luck, Hartmann's strength lay in discipline, a kind of deadly precision honed through hundreds of dogfights. He didn't charge blindly into combat. He hunted with patience, like a falcon circling its prey. He had developed a method he called see, decide, tack, disappear. First, he would climb high above the battlefield, where he could study the movement of friend and foe. Then, he chose a single target, never two, never a random shot. Once locked in, he dove from the sun, using its glare to blind his opponent. His approach was so fast and silent that the enemy often realized the danger only when his cannon shells tore through their wings. That morning, over the Romanian oil fields, the sky swarmed with P-51 Mustangs, agile, modern fighters flown by some of America's best pilots. But Hartmann's experience gave him an edge. As a Mustang pulled into a climb to protect the bombers, Hartmann struck. He descended from above, closing in, until his enemy filled the gun sight and fired only a short burst. The American plane erupted into smoke and spiraled downward. Without celebrating or even slowing down, Hartmann pulled up, scanning for his next target. Within minutes, he found another. This time, he used the confusion of battle to slip behind a second Mustang. The pilot tried to shake him off, banking hard, diving, then climbing again. But Hartmann anticipated every move. He waited for the perfect instant, half a second of alignment, and fired again. Another hit. Another plume of black smoke in the blue Romanian sky. What made Hartmann extraordinary wasn't just his accuracy, but his restraint. He never wasted ammunition, never lingered in danger, and avoided drawn-out duels. To him, air combat was not about showmanship. It was about survival. His entire philosophy was simple but ruthless. Get close, shoot once, and live to fight again. As his squadron regrouped, the red heart painted beneath his cockpit had already become a symbol, both of fear and respect. Even among Allied pilots, stories began to spread of a German ace who seemed untouchable, a man whose calm precision could turn the tide of any fight. By the time the smoke cleared that day, several Allied fighters had fallen to Hartmann's guns. Yet for him it was just another mission, another chapter in a long war, fought high above the earth, where skill, nerve, and seconds decided who would live to see another sunrise. The battle over Romania began to fade as the last waves of bombers retreated westward, leaving behind pillars of black smoke rising from the oil fields below. Hartmann's Befire 109 had performed flawlessly through the chaos. Every burst of fire, every evasive roll had been executed with mechanical precision. But as the adrenaline ebbed, a more pressing enemy appeared. The fuel gauge. Its needle hovered dangerously close to empty. He'd been in the air far longer than planned, chasing enemy fighters across miles of sky. Each climb, each high-speed dive burned precious fuel. Hartmann knew the limits of his aircraft better than anyone, and now those limits were closing in, with radio chatter fading into static and the battlefield far behind. He began the long, lonely flight back toward friendly territory. The sun dipped lower, casting long shadows over the fields below. The rhythmic hum of his engine began to sputter, a sound no pilot ever wants to hear. Hartmann switched tanks, adjusted mixture, tried every trick he knew to squeeze a few more minutes from the engine. But it was no use. The propeller coughed once, twice, and then fell silent. The only sound left was the rush of wind over his canopy. He was gliding now, powerless, searching for a safe place to land in a landscape scarred by craters and smoke. Then through the haze, he saw an open field. It would have to do. He opened the canopy, took one last look at the dead engine, and pulled the lever. The Bf-109 shuddered as he ejected, the cold air hitting his face like a slap. As he drifted downward beneath his parachute, he spotted something unexpected. A silver P-51 Mustang, circling slowly below him. The American pilot had seen his fall, and instead of firing, climbed alongside him. For a brief, surreal moment, their eyes met across the sky, two enemies suspended in silence. The Mustang's pilot raised a gloved hand and gave a slow salute before banking away into the clouds. Hartmann returned the gesture. In that fleeting exchange, there was no hatred, no triumph, only respect. The old code of the air still lived, even amid the brutality of modern war. He landed hard in a field of wild grass, rolling to absorb the impact. Disoriented but alive, he tore off his parachute harness and scanned the horizon. Within minutes, armed men appeared, soldiers, shouting in a language he didn't understand. Soviet troops, outnumbered and unarmed. Hartmann raised his hands. The exhaustion of battle and the strain of the crash hit him all at once. The world's greatest flying ace, who had ruled the skies for years, was now a prisoner on the ground. But Hartmann's story was far from over, because captivity would soon test his cunning and courage in ways no dogfight ever could. Before his capture, Erich Hartmann had already become a living legend, though he never saw himself that way. To him, every flight was a mission to survive, not to make history. Yet by 1944, His record spoke for itself. Hundreds of confirmed victories, each one earned through nerve, precision, and an almost instinctive understanding of air combat. Unlike many pilots who sought glory through daring displays, Hartmann's approach was mathematical, almost surgical. He believed in perfect timing, closing in to within a few dozen meters before firing, ensuring a single burst would end the fight. The closer he got, the greater the risk, but also the higher the certainty. It was a philosophy born not from recklessness, but from discipline. One bullet, one plane, he often said, and he meant it. Most of Hartmann's victories came not in the skies over Western Europe, but over the endless battlefields of the Eastern Front. There he faced wave after wave of Soviet aircraft, Yaks, Lags, and Il-2 Stormoviks, often outnumbered 10-1. The eastern skies were harsher, the battles longer, the losses heavier, but this was where Hartmann's instincts thrived. He learned to blend invisibly into the clouds, to use the sun's glare to his advantage, to strike unseen and vanish before the enemy could react. His comrades called him the Blonde Knight, a name that carried both admiration and awe. To his Soviet opponents, he became the Black Devil of the sky. They feared the sight of the small red heart painted beneath his cockpit, a symbol that often meant death had already found them. Yet Hartmann himself remained modest, even uneasy, about his growing fame. He refused medals until ordered to accept them, and he often reminded younger pilots that the goal was not to shoot down the enemy, but to live to fly another day. By the end of the war, his total reached 52 confirmed aerial victories, a record that no other pilot in history has ever surpassed. Each victory was logged, verified, and witnessed by his comrades. And yet, when asked about his secret, Hartmann's answer was simple: "I just flew to survive." His skill, calm under pressure, and relentless discipline made him not only the greatest fighter ace of all time, but also a symbol of the strange duality of air combat, where respect, courage, and death shared the same sky. Summer 1944. The Eastern Front burned from horizon to horizon. Soviet forces were pushing west with relentless strength, their aircraft swarming the skies in staggering numbers. For the Luftwaffe, every mission felt like a desperate attempt to hold back a tidal wave. But for Erich Hartmann, this chaos became opportunity, the kind of environment where his mastery of the air could fully unfold. It was during this period that Hartmann achieved one of the most astonishing feats in aviation history: 11 confirmed kills in a single day, not over weeks or months, but within just 2 missions, mere hours apart. That morning began like countless others. The weather was clear, the air crisp, and the ground crews worked quickly, knowing the Soviet bombers would soon be overhead. Hartmann climbed into his Bf-10, A-10, the red heart below the cockpit, glinting faintly in the sunlight. As his engine roared to life, he felt the familiar calm, the silence before the storm that always settled over him right before takeoff. Once airborne, he and his wingman climbed high above the front lines, scanning the eastern horizon. Before long, dark specks appeared, a formation of Soviet Yak-9 fighters, escorting Il-2 Stormoviks, the heavily armored ground attack aircraft. Hartmann's strategy was always the same: wait, observe, strike. He climbed higher, positioning himself above the sun, invisible against the glare. Then he dove. His first burst tore through a Yak's engine, sending it spiraling into the earth. Without hesitation, he pulled up, chose another target, and struck again. One after another, Soviet aircraft fell, their formations breaking apart in panic. Within minutes, Hartmann had downed 4 planes, but he didn't stop. After returning to base for fuel and ammunition, he took off again that same afternoon and added 7 more victories before the day was over. By sunset, he had destroyed 11 enemy aircraft, a number that would make even his fellow aces shake their heads in disbelief. But for Hartmann, it wasn't about numbers or records. Each engagement had been a battle for survival, a test of skill and control in a sky where death waited at every turn. When he landed that evening, exhausted and streaked with oil and sweat, his ground crew could hardly believe the tally. Yet Hartmann said little. He simply climbed from the cockpit, nodded to his men, and walked away toward the debrief tent, as if it were any other day. To him, the measure of success wasn't in how many enemies he shot down. It was in the simple, quiet fact that he had come back alive. For all his precision and control in combat, Erich Hartmann knew that every flight could be his last. Even the most skilled pilot couldn't escape the unpredictable nature of war. A sudden engine failure, a stray bullet, a twist of fate. One such moment came during a mission against Soviet Il-2 Stormoviks, the rugged armored aircraft that the Germans nicknamed flying tanks. It was a clear day on the Eastern Front, the kind of deceptive calm that often came before disaster. Hartmann's squadron had been dispatched to intercept a group of Stormoviks, pounding German ground positions near the Dniester River. The air shimmered with heat as they climbed, engines straining, the faint smell of oil and metal filling their cockpits. Hartmann spotted the Soviet formation first, dark silhouettes crawling low over the steppe, unleashing rockets and cannon fire into the earth below. He radioed his men, "Follow me in, aim for the leaders." Then, true to his own rule, he dove from the sun. His Bf-10-109 screamed through the air as he closed the distance, holding his fire until the target filled his sight. A short burst, perfect aim. The lead Stormovik burst into flames, trailing smoke as it plunged into the fields. He circled, found another, and struck again. The sky turned into a deadly carousel of twisting planes, exploding shells, and streaming smoke. Within minutes, Hartmann had downed several enemy aircraft, but this time, victory came at a price. A fragment of debris, a shard of twisted metal from a burning Il-2, tore through his radiator. Almost instantly, steam erupted from the nose of his plane, and the engine temperature spiked. Hartmann's instruments flickered red. The Daimler-Benz engine groaned in protest before seizing up completely. Silent, now gliding with no power, he searched frantically for a place to land. Below him stretched a sea of golden sunflowers, their heads turned toward the sun, beautiful, but deadly for a crash. He lowered his landing gear manually, but there was no time for perfection. The Bf-109 skimmed the tops of the flowers and hit the ground hard, bouncing once before sliding to a violent stop. The canopy shattered, dirt and petals flying through the air. For a moment, everything went still. Then, coughing from the smoke, Hartmann unstrapped himself and crawled from the wreckage. His hands trembled, his uniform torn, but he was alive. In the distance, the dull thunder of artillery rolled across the plains. The war still raged, indifferent to his narrow escape. He sat for a moment amid the sunflowers, catching his breath, the yellow petals swaying around him like silent witnesses. Later, he would laugh about it with his comrades, calling it a gentle landing in a field of gold. But deep down, he knew how close it had been. 1 second slower, 1 meter lower, and his story would have ended there, in that quiet Romanian field. Hartmann had survived another brush with death, and the war was far from over. Worse dangers still awaited, not in the sky but on the ground. Hartmann's crash in the sunflower field might have ended in relief, but fate wasn't done testing him. No sooner had he caught his breath than he heard the unmistakable rumble of engines in the distance. Soviet trucks, closing fast. He tried to run, limping through the tall stalks, but there was nowhere to hide. Within minutes, armed soldiers emerged, rifles raised, shouting orders he didn't understand. He raised his hands slowly. His flight suit was torn, his face streaked with oil, his parachute still tangled around his boots. To the Soviets, he was just another downed Luftwaffe pilot, a small prize in a vast, bloody war. They searched him, stripped him of his sidearm, and threw him into the back of a truck with other prisoners. Hartmann stayed silent, pretending to be dazed. Even wounded, he knew that Soviet captivity rarely ended well for captured airmen, especially aces like him. The stories whispered among German pilots were grim: long interrogations, brutal camps, and disappearances. If they learned who he really was, he'd be worth more alive, but only for as long as they could extract something from him. As the truck jolted along a dirt road, Hartmann's mind raced. He noticed only one guard watching the prisoners closely. The others relaxed and smoking, waiting for the right moment. He slumped forward, pretending to faint. When the guard leaned in to check, Hartmann sprang to life, kicking hard, grabbing the man's weapon, and leaping from the moving vehicle into a ditch. He tumbled through the mud and rolled into the tall grass, heart pounding. Behind him came shouts, then gunfire. Bullets tore through the air as he crawled on his belly toward the tri-line. By some miracle, none found him. When the sounds of pursuit faded, he stood, covered in dirt and blood, and began the long, uncertain walk back toward German lines. Hours later, exhausted and disoriented, he stumbled upon a German patrol. Relief flooded him. Until the soldiers raised their rifles, to them he looked like a Soviet saboteur in a stolen uniform. Despite his desperate shouts in German, they fired warning shots and ordered him to the ground. It took frantic explanations, his Luftwaffe identification tag, and finally, the recognition of his Red Heart insignia, before they lowered their weapons. One of the soldiers, wide-eyed, whispered, "Mein Gott, it's Hartmann." He was taken back to base, limping, filthy, and grinning faintly. Despite the ordeal, the officers who greeted him couldn't believe the story. Captured by the Soviets, escaped from a moving truck, and almost executed by his own men. Hartmann simply shrugged and said, "I got lost on the way home." The narrow escape became one of his most legendary tales, not for the number of planes shot down, but for the sheer force of will that kept him alive on the ground, where his wings could no longer save him. By the spring of 1945, the once mighty Luftwaffe was in ruins. Airfields lay shattered, fuel was scarce, and the skies that had once belonged to German pilots now swarmed with Allied bombers and Soviet fighters. The war was collapsing from every direction, but even as chaos consumed the Reich, Erich Hartmann continued to fly. He wasn't chasing glory anymore, only duty, and perhaps habit. For men like him, the cockpit had become both home and refuge. It was May 8, 1945, the final day of the war in Europe. News of Germany's surrender was spreading. Though not every unit had received the message yet, Hartmann's squadron, JG-52, was still airborne, defending the last fragments of the Eastern Front near Brno, in what is now the Czech Republic. The Soviets were advancing fast, and the air buzzed with their Yak fighters. That morning, Hartmann spotted one, a lone Yak-9 cutting across the sky below him. Instinct took over. He dove, steady and precise, lining up his gun sight. A short burst of fire, and the Soviet fighter burst into flames. It spiraled down, vanishing into the forests below. That single engagement, that last brief flare of battle, would become Erich Hartmann's 32nd and final aerial victory, the highest confirmed tally ever achieved by a fighter pilot in human history. Moments later, radio messages crackled through the air. The war was over. Germany had surrendered. For a long moment, Hartmann just sat in silence, the hum of the engine his only companion. Below him, the land stretched endlessly, villages smoldering, rivers shining like glass in the fading light. It was all over. The sky that had defined his life for so long suddenly felt empty. When he landed, the atmosphere at the airfield was heavy and strange, a mix of exhaustion, disbelief, and quiet relief. The men of JG-52 knew the Soviets were closing in, and no one wanted to fall into their hands. Hartmann and his comrades made a desperate decision. they would surrender to American forces stationed further west. Hoping for fair treatment, they packed their few remaining aircraft and began flying westward. But fate, once again, had other plans. When they reached the American lines, the Americans accepted their surrender, then under the terms of Allied agreements, handed them over to the Soviets. Hartmann realized too late what that meant. For him, captivity under the Red Army would not be a brief imprisonment. It would become a decade-long trial of endurance. The young man who had ruled the skies was about to face a new kind of war, one fought without wings, without freedom, and without mercy. When Erich Hartmann and his men were handed over to the Soviets, they knew instantly that their fate had taken a darker turn. The Americans, bound by post-war agreements, had kept their word. But for the Luftwaffe pilots who had fought so fiercely on the Eastern Front, Soviet captivity was a sentence without mercy. Hartmann, still in his 20s, was interrogated almost immediately. The Soviets knew exactly who he was, the Black Devil of the sky, the man who had destroyed hundreds of their aircraft. To them, he wasn't just a soldier, he was a symbol of German resistance, someone they wanted to break. They accused him of war crimes, including the destruction of civilian targets, charges for which there was no evidence. But that didn't matter. His guilt was predetermined. When he refused to confess to fabricated crimes, the interrogations became harsher. Hartmann's defiance only deepened their anger. He told them calmly, "I shot down planes that shot at me, nothing more." It was an answer that neither satisfied nor softened his captors. Eventually, he was sentenced to 25 years of hard labor in the Soviet prison system. Thus began a new chapter of his life, one of survival without flight, hope, or freedom. From one camp to another, Hartmann endured bitter winters, starvation rations, and endless toil in mines and construction sites. The air that had once carried him above the clouds was replaced by the choking dust of prison yards. Many men broke under those conditions. Hartmann did not. He became known among the prisoners as der Unbeugsame, the unbending one. He maintained a quiet dignity, never betraying bitterness, always carrying himself as a soldier. He often encouraged younger inmates, reminding them that surviving each day was its own victory. Even when offered better treatment in exchange for cooperation or propaganda statements, he refused. "I won't live as a liar," he told one Soviet officer. Years passed. The world outside moved on. Germany was divided. New nations rose and fell. Yet Hartmann remained behind barbed wire, forgotten by many, remembered by a few. It wasn't until 1955, 10 years after the war's end, that his ordeal finally came to an end. As part of a West German-Soviet political agreement, hundreds of German prisoners were released and sent home. Among them was Erich Hartmann. When he crossed the border into West Germany, he weighed barely a shadow of his former self, thin, pale, but alive. Reporters waited to photograph the famous ace, expecting arrogance or bitterness. Instead, they found a quiet man who simply said, "I'm home. That's enough." The prison years had taken nearly everything from him, except the one thing the Soviets could never break: his will. When Erich Hartmann returned to West Germany in 1955, the world he had left behind was gone. The once unified Reich had been split in two, its cities rebuilt from ruins, and its people trying to forget the darkness of war. For a man who had spent his life above the clouds, the silence of peace felt almost alien. Yet, despite the years of captivity and hardship, Hartmann's love for flying, for that feeling of freedom and control in the open sky, had never died. Not long after his return, he was invited to help form the new West German Air Force, the Bundesluftwaffe. Created under NATO guidance, as part of the country's rearmament. It was a strange twist of history. The former Luftwaffe ace, who had fought against the West, was now helping to rebuild its air defenses, this time as an ally. As an instructor, and later as commander of a fighter wing, Hartmann brought with him a deep respect for discipline and a clear moral compass. He taught his young pilots that courage was not recklessness, and that skill meant little without restraint. He insisted on strict flying standards, earning a reputation as a demanding but fair leader. A good pilot, he would say, is one who comes home, yet his honesty and independence often clashed with bureaucracy. Hartmann was outspoken about the political compromises that shaped the new Luftwaffe, and he criticized the adoption of certain aircraft he considered unsafe, particularly the early F. His refusal to remain silent cost him dearly. It led to tensions with superiors and eventually forced his early retirement in 19. After leaving the military, Hartmann continued to fly as a civilian instructor, training young pilots and sharing the art of flight that had defined his life. He lived quietly with his wife, Ursula, focusing on his family and avoiding the spotlight that others might have sought. Despite his fame, he never glorified war. To him, air combat had been a duty, not a passion. There is nothing noble in killing, he once said, only in surviving. He passed away in 1993, at the age of 71, leaving behind a record that remains unmatched. 352 confirmed aerial victories, and a legacy of discipline, courage, and humility. 4 years later, in 1997, the Russian Federation formally annulled all Soviet charges against him, finally clearing his name. Today, Erich Hartmann is remembered not only as the most successful fighter ace in history, but also as a man who endured the rise and fall of empires, survived captivity and injustice, and returned to rebuild the very skies he once fought across. His story is one of skill and survival, but above all of a man who refused to surrender his integrity, even when the world around him fell apart.